I'm back in here.
All right. I'm John Feldman with the Rally Call.
And I'm Mike Liddon.
Mike, today we have a very special guest. We have Rosa Yapuri joining us yet again. And Rosa, how about an introduction? And more importantly, tell us a little bit about what you do, because I find it very interesting because it aligns very well with the purpose and the vision of the Rally Call.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Mike, for having me again. I'm excited to talk to you guys. So what I do in a nutshell is I build and architect sales teams and make it into a well-oiled machine. But my passion really lies on transforming those sales managers and helping them transform the sales organization, because you find sometimes that the sales reps become, stagnant. They don't perform anymore. They cannot meet quota. And it's not just another process. So I help them, motivate them, and use data to be able to reach their peak performance again.
So, Rosa, you train a lot of sales leaders in order to get the best out of a team. Now, when you train and you're learning about the new teams, especially as they relate to first-time sales leaders, help us understand what you see as sort of some characteristics of the first-time sales leaders that you've seen across all of the wide engagements that you've done.
So one of the things that I found out is that they get promoted, right? They believe this is their job because there's more money, that's like the next step on their career. But what they don't understand is that things also change, the responsibilities change, and they don't think that way. They believe that revenue is the only objective. And so what they used to do great, which was sell and be very successful as a salesperson, they want everybody else to become one like them. But they do it in a way where they tell them to do it how the manager did it. You know what I mean? Like, they didn't take in consideration that people are different. We're all diverse, right? We have different narratives. We come from different backgrounds. And so it is very difficult to be able to train people and motivate them if you don't really understand that we're different. We're salespeople, but we're still different. And so, we talked about this before. They're trying to clone themselves 5 times, right? And they have to really go in there and understand that this is not the purpose of them being a manager. And it's not great for the company.
Rosa, if I wouldn't mind just unpacking that a little bit. This idea of connecting different approaches to actually being able to maximize revenue. Like, when you kind of take a step back out of a situation, like that kind of makes sense, right? Like, there's lots of different ways to achieve maximum revenue. One approach isn't always the best way, and people have different strengths, etc. Why do you think that isn't more obvious right out of the gate for a first-time sales leader? Is it something around trust? Is it something around not being able to understand that concept as a whole? Like, why do you think that is?
It's so much trust. That is amazing. I mean, if you think about it, they are in charge of, handing in a number, right? And for them, the best solution is what they have experienced in the past. And so that's the only way. And for them, getting to that number, there's only one way. And they want to replicate that way. But it is so different because everybody's personality is different. I mean, you know about this, and you know about everything. Everybody develops differently and requires different type of motivational talk or preps, or one-on-ones. So I think that's what it is. You tend to do what worked for you.
It would seem like natural that if you look at it, I'm being put into the role as sales leader now, right? I was successful as a salesperson. Therefore, I need to get my team to do the things that I did, and then everybody will be successful. Like, that seems like I can understand the logic in that. And we know from experience now that becoming super rep doesn't work. But Rosa, would you share some pitfalls and some like negative consequences that come from running that strategy on the team?
So I'm going to tell you, of course, a story of mine when I was leading this team. Always come back to the storytelling here, John.
Yeah.
So I was trying to do the same thing. I got promoted. I was getting trained, but I wasn't there yet. And I asked members of my teams to go visit the customer in the way that I would do it. I said, you have to tell them this, and this is what you have to do. And it was about tell, right? That's the experience that I have with other sales leaders. And I did it too.
Mm-hmm.
So I tell them this, and he finally stopped and he looked at me. He goes, Rosa, I am not as charming as you are. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, you are telling me what worked for you, but you are Latina, you're a woman, you like to laugh, you tell jokes. He goes, I'm a technical person. I like more serious conversations. I can't do what you do, right? And I realized, you're right, Eric. You're different than I am. And I would start to think, I'm like, come on, you're selling yourself short, but it's not, that wasn't it. It was that everybody has like a different approach, and you can still make it to top salesperson, right? And not change your personality. So I think that empowering them to really find that intrinsic motivation is the key. And you're not going to find intrinsic motivation if you're asking somebody to change who they are, right?
Yeah. No, that you raise a really good point, because I look across the multitude of people that I've managed, and I'm just going through it in my head, the ones that were very successful and how different they are from each other.
Yes.
And how different they are from me. Yet the success was always still there. And I know, Mike, you deal with this all the time in your current role. Do you see that as well?
I do. But to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here, I think that there are either common things that you see as roads to success as well. And maybe if we bring it down a little bit more tactically, and Rosa, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I personally am a believer that there's like certain non-negotiables or like basics that folks need to really execute well, no matter what their personality or no matter their approach. Maybe like, would you agree with that, or do you challenge that? I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Oh my gosh, you touched a very important point. And I see this a lot now when I go and train. We deal with a lot of sales enablement, by the way, right? And you are creating a lot of really good processes, but the adoption is not there. I mean, it doesn't happen quickly, and sometimes goes to 50% to 60% from the sales side. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering and asking, why is this happening? Back in the day, of course, I'm not going to date myself. Like if my boss told me to do something, you input this for this data this day, I went and did it. There was no doubt. I don't like it. This doesn't serve. I mean, there was a little bit of conversation, but we knew that there was this discipline and following the main strategy that was important, right? He was communicating the strategy to us, and we all needed to work towards one goal, right? And I think there's two problems right now. One is that lack of discipline to really follow one goal. And it happens because the goal of the salesperson is not aligned with the goal of the company. I want what is going to be good for me, but I'm not sure I want what is going to be good for the team and therefore good for the company. And so these conversations need to happen more and more, and they're not happening. You got to do this, you got to do this. They don't do it, and that's where it stalls. And I think that once we get into these really deep conversations of why is that the problem, then you start getting into, there's different purposes for people. There's different reasons why you work in this company, believe it or not. And so It really goes back to aligning your team for the greater good.
So you raise a good point there, and I think that it's probably time where we shine a light on it. And it sounds as if, Rosa, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the first time sales leader has to clue in that their purpose has changed, right? When you get put into this role, your purpose is not to be an individual contributor driving revenue. Your purpose now is to lead other people into getting the best out of them, and you have to figure that out, right? So their purpose has changed. Would you agree?
Oh my gosh, John. That clicked on my head one time when I was doing a leadership training, and I just wanted to know what they love about their job, right? And so I had a question. So what do you love? Why do you get up in the morning and are excited to go to your job? And their answer was, I love seeing the customers. I love closing that deal. I love just moving them around the funnel and just finally get the contract. I get such an emotion and such adrenaline doing that. And I said, I used to happen to me when I was a salesperson. And I'm sure it happened to you when you were a salesperson.
Yeah.
But you're not a salesperson anymore. You're a manager. Somebody else is doing that. Somebody else has that purpose. Your purpose is to manage the people that are going to do that. And said, so what would be your purpose now that you know that you're not the one closing the deals? And it was a shock for them because they were like, I don't know what my purpose is. I've never really thought about it, right? And that is why you find so many leaders and managers closing deals for their people, which is such a horrible bottleneck, right? I mean, they're always traveling, they're always calling on customers. And I'm like, and they don't have time for one-on-ones. They don't have time for training. They don't have time for coaching, but they want to be out there closing that deal with the customer. And there's one manager and there could be 10 sales reps and he has to go and check every single one of them. I mean, how is that working out? Right? Instead of empowering and elevating those 10 people to achieve their maximum goal. And I think the purpose doesn't switch just automatically like this.
For this idea of empowering your team to be successful, and again, through the lens of a first-time frontline sales leader, you mentioned regular coaching, you mentioned one-on-ones, things like that. Are there other core fundamental things that a frontline sales leader needs to ensure they get really good at really quickly to be able to empower their teams for success?
Good question.
I like that. So what I did first when I realized this was not as easy as people said, right, to be a manager, you start to get to know your team, but really know them, right? Not looking at their data, not looking at just the performance, but looking, what are their strengths? What are their skills? Are they lacking skills that you can recognize? Because as a sales manager and as a salesperson, you can recognize which skills somebody is missing, right? And so really going deep into why certain person is not performing or why this other one is performing and getting twice as much, right? So getting to know your team, I think, is like the first thing. And then you have to be, as a first line manager, you have to be very clear of what you want from them. Like you have to be very clear of your expectations. And what happens is a lot of sales managers want to be the friend of their sales reps. They want to be loved. They want to be laughed with them. And, because that's the relationship you have with your customers. And they believe that being friendly and taking them out, for drinks or whatever is going to help that camaraderie, which is going to bring revenue. But it's a surprise. That's not enough, right? I mean, you have to have the skills. Like I could be happy, but if I don't have the skills, then how am I going to do it, right? And so I think that they have to understand their team and then be very clear with expectations And sometimes the salespeople will, push back. And they have to be strong and saying, this is what the company decided to do. These are our expectations. We're all going to rally this way. And that is, I find, one of the toughest things for a first line manager to do, because remember, they were peers before, and now he gets promoted. And now that difficulty to know that now there is a difference there is hard for that first line manager to be able to enforce whatever strategy.
So how do you, in your engagements, once people have flipped the switch and they realize that their purpose has changed, what do you do to empower them to give them the skills in order to be the manager that now we expect of them, i.e., you're going to grow through your people, you're going to be successful through your people, you're going to be successful by probably doing the hardest thing right now, which is it's quarter end, there's closing calls happening, and we don't want you on the call, Mr. Manager or Mrs. Manager. We want the rep on the call executing the plan. How do you coach that? Like, what are the things that you do with that team? Because I mean, that's going to be pretty foreign to a lot of them. They love to control the revenue.
They are so, that is interesting, because I mentor a lot of leaders, VPs of sales, and they, that's what they do. They want to go out there and they call it shadow the sales rep, and I call it overshadow, because you're like on top of them. And so I teach them the three things that are very important for motivation. And without motivation, you don't win anything. You don't get anything. Seriously. Like, if I don't want to, I'm not going to do it, right? And so I just said there is three things that are important that you have to do. One is give them autonomy. What does autonomy mean? Like, what does autonomy mean for you, Jon? What do you think?
When someone asks me to perform a task and I have the autonomy to do it in the way that I think would be best.
Right. That they let you make a mistake, be creative, be unique, be you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, imagine if somebody says, listen, I trust you. This is what I want. Now you have to be very clear of that expectation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because most sales managers think that their sales rep think like that. They do. Mm-hmm. And so they said, I want you to do this, but there isn't a clear expectation. I always use the words that Brené Brown taught me, where, okay, you understood? Yes. Paint the picture of the outcome. Like, visualize what the outcome will be for you. And when they visualize it, they think, wait, I didn't understand what I needed to do, right? So clarity and feedback is super important when you ask something, and then give them autonomy. But if you give them autonomy without clear expectations, then we're in a big mistake. And that's what happens. People don't want to give autonomy because it hasn't worked, but it wasn't work because of the freedom of creativity, but the lack of clear expectations. But I'm talking like crystal clear. I can visualize, I can repeat it in a different words,
I love that. Like, I as an aside, I give my son the autonomy to keep his room clean, and I do a terrible job of setting what my expectation of clean is. So now I don't open the door. But I love your example of autonomy. That really hits home. I love that.
Yeah.
I wrote some things down here based on what you just shared, Rosa, and I kind of had motivation, skills, expectations. I put big brackets around it and said autonomy, kind of applying to all three. And one thing that I often think about, I'd just love to hear your reaction of this, is I find that, really effective frontline sales leaders are able to generate insights with their sellers around those three things. Like, okay, oh, wow, okay, yeah, no, if I do this is actually going to be really good for me in my life, motivation. Or, oh, okay, yeah, right. So maybe I probably should approach this a little bit more differently in this way, in this interaction, skills, right? Or, oh, geez, I better do these things that are hard and do them consistently, or I'm not going to get to my outcomes, expectations. And one thing that I find really, really interesting about first-time sales leaders is they're really good at getting those aha moments with their clients when they're in a sales cycle. But then
Yes.
sometimes they have a hard time doing it with their own team members. And I always struggle, like, why? Why is that the case? Because it's kind of the same skill set.
Mike, I wish I could have that answer. I want to say that it's happened to me. I back in the day, when I'm always going to be telling my story, so sorry about this, but back onto another vulnerable moment. The director that I had came to me and he says, Rosa, how is it that you're so good at communicating with your customer, that, have such a strong bond and relationship with your customers, and it's hard for you to communicate with the team? And I said, I don't know. I expect the team to be my team and to know what I want, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the expectation from the customer, right? I expect little of the customer because I'm the one kind of doing the service, if you want to say. But when you're part of my team, I'm expecting you to work as hard as I do. I'm expecting you to do this as much as I do. And I think that's a big mistake, right? Because it's all about expectations at the end of the day. So it's the same way. It's really hard. You are a very different person with a customer, right? You're a great listener. Ask me if you are a great listener in your home. Most of the time after my training, they're like, my relationship with my teenager has improved just because you taught me how to listen. Mm-hmm. Because they can listen to a customer, but they're not used to listening, for example. So it is different the way we communicate with a customer than when we communicate internally. And that is why many salespeople have a bad reputation,
How much of that is like not knowing how versus, quite frankly, not putting the effort or holding ourselves to that expectation?
I think there's a little bit of, and again, vulnerability moment here. I think there's a little bit of ego there.
Yes, 100% there's ego. Absolutely. 100% there's ego. Yes.
It is ego. It's terrible. And that's one of the things that I train about. I go, okay, let's just call it what it is. You have an ego. I have it too. And I had it bigger when I was a really good salesperson. When I met quota and I beat everybody in my division, my ego couldn't fit in the door because everybody's praising me, right? Everybody's like, and so suddenly that ego gets in the way. And it's hard to manage egos. Let me tell you, it's hard to manage mine. It's hard to manage sales managers' egos. And I had to do that when I was a chief revenue officer because they were all have been successful to get to that level.
Yeah, you raised such a good point. So I love the autonomy point, and I'm really enjoying the ego one. And I'll tell you a story. I had a young rep who was coming up through the ranks that I used to work with, and in full admittance, transparency, I looking back on it now that we're in therapy right now, Rosa, I let my ego sometimes get the best of me, and I look back on it and they are uber successful. Like they've been really successful at the company that we were with together, at the subsequent company that they went to. And then this person like somehow prospected into like the dream job and the dream company that he wanted to work at and now works there. But I looked back on it, and the moment I let my ego go, right? And I just trusted in his autonomy with the expectations of the result, he flew higher and faster, right? Than when I was the opposite. So that key that you just said for the first time sales leaders listening to this, ego and autonomy, massive. Is there anything else that you would call out aside from those two?
Before I go there, I want to tell you why this is hard, because giving somebody autonomy almost go against your ego. You know? So this is what it is too. But once you break that, like you said, John, it's magic. It's really magic. And I'm going to tell you, to the first line managers, they're overwhelmed with meetings with reports, those things just fill your calendar. Right. And so add to those customer visits that you want to do and deals you want to close, then there's really no time for training and coaching and empowering and elevating your team. You just don't have any time. So you have to do a fantastic time management.
Oh.
And I think that third one, it's a big issue.
Actually, I love that you said that, because in our series of 8 with a great, now that we've done, oh God, I can't even count how many we've done now, but that is a constant theme. So when I ask the question, hey, so what advice would you give to a frontline a first-time sales manager? I've heard a number of times, you got to be prepared that your calendar is going to get really full, and you're going to have to start to prioritize what's really important and what can wait. And I say, well, what's really important? Like, you got to focus on the coaching, mentorship. The other stuff just has to find a time. So you're dead right. Time management is, I would agree with you there.
And I think that's any aspect of leadership, John.
Yeah, fair.
Yes.
I think if you want to progress your career further and further, that crunch, not just for time, but for prioritization in general, because all of a sudden your time's going to fill up. Then it's like, okay, well, now I need to really push things away because I need to prioritize everything, right? And I know in my own career, and I'm sure the two of you found this as well, the more you work through things and take on more responsibility, the more it becomes a problem.
And you know what? You let go. You don't prioritize based of, your Stephen Covey, urgent, important, and stuff like that. You're like, what I don't like to do. Okay. That goes to the side. Not that it's important, not important. Is okay. Reports, I don't really like this that much. Or having conversations with my team on a one-on-one. What do I talk about? Uncomfortable conversations. It's just a waste of time because, let's face it, the salesperson is lying to the manager is lying to the salesperson. There isn't that connection and really agenda for those one-on-ones. So those go out. And they go back into reporting to their superiors or being on the road with the salespeople. And you're like, so that's a time management that I'm talking about. Like, really not just put squares in your calendar, but your mindset has to understand what is important for success, right? Regardless of whether you like to do it or not.
No, I know that our final talking point was a little bit about the supporting tactics underneath, because the one thing about the rally call, I know Mike it's already going through Mike's head. We're all about what's the strategy and the supporting tactics, right? And we talked about this before we met to do the show, Rosa, but we talked about what are the things that the frontline sales leader or the first-time sales leader have to be experts at, right? And we talked about some of the methodologies or some of the trainings. Like, they have to be experts so that they can coach and train and mentor. Is that correct? Did I cover that right?
So I'm going to tell you, if I had to teach one frontline manager one thing, and they're like, you have time to just one thing, Rosa, what would you do? They can read on their own the processes. There's so many books out there. They can do that on their own. But the one thing I would teach them is how to coach, because how to coach is not to tell, is to ask in a way where you get the answers that your sales rep had anyway, but because of narratives and mindsets cannot figure it out on their own. So if you keep practicing this coaching, you're going to wake up this ability in your sales rep to think on their own, which is, and I mentor this again, I'm like, do this coaching. And it's very easy. It's what do you have in your mind, and then mirror, and they're like, what is a good outcome? How are you going to do it? Okay. Has this been difficult for you before? Yes. How are you going to solve this? I mean, just a bunch of questions. And I have a series of questions it's just 5 questions really. And they start learning to solve their own problems. And I remember I told this to a friend, to a mentee, and she was a vice president at a big company here. And I said, when you're done with this autonomy piece and this coaching, you're going to have so much time. You're going to be like, why aren't people emailing me anymore? Because they're solving their own problems.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I was a chief revenue officer. I didn't have that many emails. And I was like, because, I mean, my VPs knew what to do, right? I mean, my time was actually spent more with, board directors and stuff like that. But once you get to that rhythm and they get it, and now the sales rep has trust, they feel confident that they can come up with a solution when they're in front of the customer, and they don't have to come and ask you for permission or help. But that's very important. But sometimes salespeople want to be needed. That's another part. The ego part kicks in, right? And again, every time we're trying to do something nice, the ego kicks in, and I'm like, wait, I want to be the expert. I want to be needed. So it's hard for them to train them in a way so they can just move on independently without needing you.
Rosa, that's so enlightening. And like, if I echo it back, like, that's truly empowering your sales team to solve problems on their own. And I think of like, now you, back to the prioritization piece of a frontline sales leader, now you have time, right? And now you can use that time, not necessarily to coach to a deal or an account, but to then empower that person even further to remove structural barriers within the organization, barriers to revenue that might be slowing down not just that person, but your entire team. And now your impact as a leader is exponentially greater, right?
You hit it right there. So once you're done with empowering your team, but really empowering, because I don't think people really understand that autonomy needs to be there for each of these sales reps. Your job, is not longer, I mean, you still have to coach, but your job becomes take away all the barriers that your salespeople have. And that became my job. That was my full-time job at the end of my tenures. It was, okay, what is stopping you? Okay, here, no. Is it supply chain? Is it revenue? Is it this report? Why are we doing this metric? And so it became taking things away so they can run freely. And that even increase or increment the autonomy part, right? Because then now they can really operate. And that's a big advice. But that's going to take time. For the first line manager, it's not going to happen overnight because you have to train people to think on their own.
Yeah, and from what you just said, it's exactly why one of the courses that we've built for the Rally Call and our training courses is removing barriers to revenue, right? Because once you get to this state that we've talked about, you're going to have this time to do it. Well, here's a course that's going to enable you how to do it. Look, this has been absolutely fantastic. It's everything that I've always dreamed of, Rosa, because you're always such a great guest and you're always such a great person to have a conversation with. So thank you for agreeing to take your 8 with the great and turn it into, I don't know how many questions there were, maybe 25 or 30 with the great, but you know that you're always welcome back on the Rally Call.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I love having this conversation. I can talk about this forever because I'm very passionate about elevating teams. So thank you again.
Rosa, if any of our listeners would like to leverage some of your work and some of the work that you do, where can they find you? Email, phone, or website?
Yeah, they can go into my website or connect with me in LinkedIn. It's Rosa, ROSA, Upari, YUPARI.com. Or you can find me with the same name at my LinkedIn, and I'll connect with them.
Fantastic. Well, we wrap up another edition of the Rally Call. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
That was awesome. That was so much fun.
Good?
Yeah.
Rosa, the question is though, Rosa, is